Well, very good afternoon, morning, or evening to you, and welcome to this edition of A Reason for Hope. Sean Richards hosting today, joined by the Burrito for our famous Apologetics Monday. Now, if you are wondering, maybe listening on Reach Radio or one of our radio affiliates, why I don't sound like I am all here, I am just recovering from a very gnarly flu and just made it on the cusp of recovering while not being 100%. But I thought that it was fitting that if, of course, while I'm gathering together my biological faculties and still are able to handle this kind of topic and issue, that would give all of you even fewer excuses and opportunities to know that this is a lot more straightforward than it seems. And note that you have my full permission to, of course, attend or listen to any other podcast if I happen to pass out, because we're still in that sweet spot. Pray for me, because that actually accomplishes something, but nonetheless, I am grateful that you are all here. And note that, as is the time of this recording, Monday, and Star Wars Day, believe it or not, may the 4th be with you, we are, of course, focusing on one particular topic. We've moved from atheism in our venue after Islam, and of course are dealing with the more common objections that you will hear from atheists in your exchanges with them, both in person and on the internet. But the purpose of this broadcast is to answer your Bible questions, so note that that will still be an option. With the time that is remaining to us after this broadcast, we will also be using the remainder of the time to answer your Bible questions, which you can send to us at the following venues. First of all, we are live streaming on YouTube at A Reason 4 Hope. If you subscribe to us there and hit the notification bell, you will be able to send us your questions both during and after the broadcast from 4 to 5 p.m. every single weekday, and we'd be happy to engage with you on that. Facebook is CCFTUCSON, or Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson. That, of course, will be where you can engage with us whenever you are on the Facebook page of things. Twitter, or X, is SCOTTR4H. If you tweet us at ScottR4H, then we'll be happy to address your questions, just like any other social media platform. And lastly, if you want to avoid social media, our website is calvarychristianfellowship.com. Click on the Watch Live tab, and you'll be sent to a page where you can watch us live. Or you can join us after hours by emailing us your questions at questions@areason4hope.org. Note that that is open and available for you to use for its intended purpose, which is to send us your Bible questions. If you would like to host organized debates or dialogues, that will, of course, not be the purpose of this broadcast. You can contact us, and we will set something up on separate channels, times, or occasions. But if you have sincere questions pertaining to the Bible, Christianity, the Christian life, current events as pertaining to the Christian life, objections made by other world religions, and insofar as we are able to address them, I would most likely defer to the Burrito, though, we will be honored to not only provide clarity on these issues, but hopefully give you further confidence in the sort of things that we are basing our hope on, the reasons that establish them. So without further ado, and definitely holding on to the Lord with both hands to give me the strength to get through this, let's take a moment to pray and see what he has to say, and note that questions and follow-ups on these topics are welcome as well. Dad, thank you for the honor and opportunity you've given us to not only be in your word, but among your people, and I ask for a special anointing to be in your spirit as well. Enable me with the health, strength, and clarity of mind to be able to address these topics in a way that you yourself would were you here. And as we invite your presence, your very spirit, to equip us for those good works, that the gift of prophecy would be exercised here, that hearts and minds would not only be strengthened, but also convicted and drawn closer to you, knowing that the objections that are made against you and the thoughts that we are called to take captive are not as boisterous, strong, and confident as they may seem. I ask that your people would be encouraged, your enemies would be converted, and that ultimately your messenger would be strengthened for this good work. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, well, let's get into the topic. Obviously, we've done a number of discussions over the last couple weeks regarding atheism and the assumptions that, of course, are made along the way and what we ought to be sensitive towards when discussing these issues with people who don't share our fundamental worldviews. But when it comes to the worldview itself, the main divide between the atheist and the Christian position is often claim to be the idea that atheists are pro-science while Christians ignore science so that they can follow the supernatural. At least this is the claim. Science is the fortress of the atheist that they would fall back on when they try to claim that they are rational as they dismiss the evidence that you give them and continuously change the subject. But the good news is that when it comes to conversations with atheists, this won't always be the case. And while they have a common script, it's not always going to have a common motive. There will be, of course, the same types of things said to you by the insincere atheist as you would by the sincere. They may rationally conclude that the beliefs of naturalism, that there's no such thing as the supernatural, is a natural and common sense position. And there will also be arrogant bullies who will, of course, make the same objections, but with an intended goal of wasting your time rather than just presenting their perspective against your own. The key in these issues, and the most important thing, is when having a conversation with somebody, in taking control of an issue, it's important to choose your battles and to be able to recognize the sincere from the insincere. And the good news is, when this topic especially comes up, the conflict, allegedly, between science and religion, it is very easy to spot the kinds of people who won't listen to anything that you have to say, at least perhaps not at this point in their life, no matter how much time or how clear that you spend communicating these things with them, as opposed to the person who's genuinely interested in something that would maybe provide more information to their worldview, who doesn't think that they have all the answers, but naturally believes their position, otherwise they wouldn't hold that, and give you the opportunity to note the difference. But this requires, again, when it comes to this issue in particular, to know a little bit about the history of science. The best way to separate the men from the boys, the sincere from the insincere, is how well they respond to the actual facts on the table. So if it's worth it to you to figure out not just whether or not the person you're talking to is worth the effort or not, rather than just dismiss people who genuinely may come to a saving relationship with Jesus in time, what needs to be understood is, when the objection is brought up, what are the reasons they would say that Christians are anti-science and atheists are pro-science? And hopefully, with not only a little bit of insight and a few monkey wrenches thrown into the assumptions that even that claim brings to it, you may find yourself having a lot more productive conversations than you'd realize when talking to someone who sounds just like the arrogant troll, but turns out actually to be a decent human being. Because believe it or not, they're found amongst every group, even among atheists. So let's start with the definition of science. The way it's often treated, science is understood by the atheist as evidence against the existence of God by definition. That when they say science, it's just proof that you're wrong. Or at best, the concept of science, and this is towards the more sincere end of things, is treated as if the very concept itself is at odds with belief in God. And in order to address this issue, you simply need to know what the word science means before its significance is handed to you by someone contrary to your worldview. Obviously, we don't want to put ourselves in a position where someone else has the power of deciding what we mean by what we believe. We, of course, have our own dictionary, and the most important part of communication is common language, that you are taking the time to say, what do you mean by science? What do you mean by God? What do you mean by belief? And I'm not saying that to do the whole, what do you mean by God sort of Jordan Peterson impression there. You can hold your applause on that one. But make sure that you're clarifying your terms with someone, especially when it comes to matters of science, because if they believe that there's a definition of science that would mean not the existence of God, then of course there is a conflict between science and the concept of God. But if the actual definition of science implies something other than that, then of course more doors are opened up than closed. And it's worth noting that as far as having your own definitions handed to you, this will be the first and most important, fork in the road when it comes to determining whether the person you're talking to is sincere or not. If they, for example, just make up a definition of science that no one in history has ever believed, and start cursing you, speaking from experience, you know they're not in a place where they can or should be spoken to. You gain nothing by, of course, spending time there, and you lose nothing by leaving because, again, talking to them and convincing them of what they mean regarding the definition of science is not your responsibility. This is the position they brought up, and they didn't know what they were talking about. How many more times does that have to happen before you realize that this person is just there to waste your time? But if, on the other hand, they give and it doesn't have to be word for word, but an accurate view of science, and you hold them to that and say, well, what about that then would put it at odds with the concept or definition of a supernatural conscious entity, something like God? That is, again, where you can use their definition to ask where the conflict ultimately stems from. Because the word science, at its core foundations, the etymology, if you don't mind my mispronunciation, literally means knowledge, to know, or of course to understand. And in a more proactive sense, the field of science is regarding the study of cause and effect, which is, again, like the scientific method, examining operations or laws through the scientific method, which is, of course, in the 5-step process: find a problem, form a hypothesis, gather data, test it, and then form a conclusion. Now, obviously, the focus of this is centered around visible and tangible laws within nature. And this is where the atheist will likely try to push the issue and say that, well, since God is not visible according to your own Bible, the book of Colossians says that Jesus is the image of the invisible God, then it's not scientific because it's not seen in the realm of the visible, of the testable, of the tangible. This is, again, the worldview of naturalism. But noting that within the definition of science, there's a few assumptions that need to be made in order for the concept of science, the study of cause and effect, the concept of recognizing that if I ask a question, form this from the problem into a hypothesis, examine the data and form a conclusion, that there are assumptions made into believing that that will actually work. The first 3, I think, that are relevant to this conversation, and you're welcome to research more, is that first and foremost, in order to examine tangible laws within nature, there's assuming that there are universal laws in nature that are discovered, not invented. Despite all the time that people would oftentimes spend on TikTok or Instagram where they see these interviews of people saying, you know, before Isaac Newton invented gravity, people could just fly around. Obviously, that's a parody unless you're talking to a very specific kind of individual. But it's noting that those laws are always in place, that they will always be in place, and that they can't be violated by nature because they are a law. That, of course, unless something else, another law, acts against them, that they will be the norm, that you can test these things on the basis of what they are as opposed to finding out or introducing what these things could be. The second assumption in the scientific process is that those laws, notice, not the concept, or not the act of physics, but the concept of physics itself, the law of gravity, the law of thermodynamics, the laws of motion, these aren't visible or tangible themselves. They are universally influential authorities that make a tangible impact on nature without being nature itself. Within the natural, there is a, dare I say, supernatural or other than natural force that influences these things that we recognize as scientific laws, chemistry laws, physics laws. All of these things are, again, not just discovered rather than invented, but they themselves are not tangible or visible. And the third and most relevant to this conversation is that the laws of physics, chemistry, and so forth have unchallenged authority over all of nature. That without these laws in place, and this goes into the teleological or the fine-tuning argument, the argument from design, these laws are unchallenged in their authority over all of nature, that they can influence the natural despite not being natural themselves, and this borderline omnipotent presence is in fact a constant, that when you're forming these experiments, when you're making these observations, they will always be there, and that they are numbers that you can count on based on the influence and reality of what they are, rather than something that would be introduced. Because, of course, without those things in place, even atheist scholars would note this, that the laws of physics, the laws of the universe as a whole, chemistry and so forth, if they weren't fine-tuned to the exact degree by which we determine that, and not determine actually, but recognize and discover, across the board, as exactly as they are now, the universe would have either shrunk in on itself or wouldn't have reacted in such a way where it would have come into existence, even according to their secular models. Those are assumptions that the Christian and the atheist can both agree on. And I'm just want to make clear here, I'm saying the Christian specifically as opposed to the atheist, because 98% of the time the number and percentage has decreased slightly since the advent of atheism, but departing from Islam and confronting that. But in noting the interesting features in all of these conversations, it's all centered around their objections specifically to the Judeo-Christian God. So noting the relevance of our conversation, and the majority of atheists who aren't being executed by Muslims, they, of course, have their main beef with the God of Judaism and Christianity. So I'm making that an intentional point. But notice that with these assumptions, the Christian can acknowledge there are, in fact, universal laws. We simply recognize the mind that introduced them. That's part of the teleological argument. The laws not being visible or tangible themselves is in favor of our position, because just like God, there are things beyond nature that can influence it. And of course, the laws of unchallenged authority over all of nature is part of what we mean by God also sharing those kinds of attributes, that it's something the atheist claims to be on his side when it serves as an illustration and example of the concept of God itself. Now notice I haven't said specifically the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but just the concept of a supernatural and conscious will beyond nature. That's what the atheist would generically object to, but as a Christian, of course, I would recognize Jesus of Nazareth as, in his view, what that God was, because he demonstrated it with a public miracle, including but not limited to his resurrection from the dead, but that's another conversation. So notice that all the assumptions necessary for the scientific method to work, that again, there are laws in nature that aren't invented, they are discovered, that these things have authority over all of nature, and that they aren't visible or tangible themselves, are all things that wouldn't conflict with the concept of God. While the atheist assumption, separate, ironically, from the concept of science itself, is that if something isn't visible or tangible, that means that it doesn't exist. Now, we can argue the principle of pure empiricism, that there isn't anything that exists beyond what can be interacted with pertaining to the five senses. There are other people who've been smarter about this and have simply said it's not relevant to or couldn't be comprehended by us because we are sensory-based beings. But of course, if you allow for an existence and will beyond nature to interact with nature according to the very principles he or she set up, then of course you can note that the interaction is in fact possible, that a revelation from God would be a lot more productive than speculation about the supernatural, which was more about what individuals like David Hume were objecting to. But the point being made is just that. There was a quote from the founder and inventor of the scientific method, known as Sir Francis Bacon, who said that a little philosophy likens man's mind to atheism, but in-depth philosophy inclines men's mind to religion. So if we're noting the person who himself established, or is known as the father of empiricism, who invented the scientific method, the process by which we can analyze and form conclusions from data, he himself recognized that the issue isn't based off of the science. It's based on the philosophy, the mindset, and worldview. And he acknowledged that people who are novices in these topics tend to bend a certain way. I didn't say it, he did. But if, on the other hand, you get down to the actual thoughts and processes, the philosophy that actual science is based on, you find that there are more grounds for religion than the atheist would often give them credit for. And even reinforcing this with an observation from Sir Isaac Newton, who himself also was a Christian, he said, "Atheist is so senseless and odious to mankind that it never had many professors." So if you want to say that you're on the side of science, yet the founders of the scientific method and the single most influential scientists of all recorded history would disagree with the philosophical conclusions your view of science led to, then be sensitive to your assumptions. Because while the atheist position is arguing pure empiricism, that there's no such thing as anything beyond what can be interacted with sight, smell, taste, touch, handle, and so forth, the other assumption that needs to be addressed is, once again, that is baseless according to the very people who founded the very fields that they are not just being parasitical towards, that they are trying to feed off of, while at the same time undermining the basis of, but with the best of assumptions and intentions towards the person that we're speaking to, hopefully just simply has been misunderstood. And this is where we then will have the opportunity to provide some clarity if we're willing to put in a little bit of homework. Now, this is where then the history of science comes in, because while there are plenty of people in the atheist community that would say that they have a monopoly on scientific contributions in history, starting from the Enlightenment all the way to the modern day, we can start with the Enlightenment and ask what kind of worldview fostered, cultivated, introduced the scientific fields of study, the principles that shaped the modern enlightened world, that emphasize the concept of science that allegedly is in conflict with God, and ask, is it any coincidence that their worldviews lined up with one position over the other? Let's go through some popular names amongst the scientific revolution, specifically regarding the 16th century, what's known even by secular historians as the Enlightenment, and ask if these individuals all have something in common. Let's start with Nicholas Copernicus. He was the one who famously founded the Copernican model of the universe and was a born-again Christian. Tycho Brahe was the last naked-eye astronomer, someone who didn't, of course, use telescopes for his analyses, yet himself was an avid astronomer. He was a Christian. Giordano Bruno was the first astronomer who recognized stars were suns with their own planets. This individual, of course, would be the inspiration for modern-day astronomers, and he also was a Christian. Francis Bacon, as I mentioned before, the father of empiricism who invented the scientific method, among other things, he was a Christian. Galileo Galilei was the father of modern astronomy and himself also was a Christian. René Descartes was the father of modern philosophy and was also a Christian. Blaise Pascal, who was the inventor of probability theory, a field that atheists use a lot in order to argue their models for the universe, was also a born-again Christian. Robert Boyle, who was the father of modern chemistry, that was a Christian. Antoine von Leeuwenhoek, who was the father of microbiology, was also a Christian. Isaac Newton, I mentioned earlier, the invention of calculus and the discoverer of the laws of motion, was a Christian. Joseph Priestley, who discovered oxygen, not invented, but discovered it, was a Christian. Edward Jenner, the inventor of the vaccine, and was the man single-handedly responsible for abolishing smallpox as a modern disease. Saved more lives than anyone in history, you could argue. He was a Christian. John Dalton, who pioneered atomic theory before Marie Curie found out the hard way that you shouldn't put it on your lap. He was a Christian. Michael Faraday, the father of electromagnetism, he was a Christian. On and on it goes. But when it ultimately comes down to it, what would even knowing 4 of these names accomplish in a conversation with an atheist about whether or not there is conflict between science and God? Well, would it be maybe a coincidence if all of the most influential and pioneering, introducing, not dragging off of the coattails of the work of atheists before them, but the kinds of people who were willing to look into these areas of study, who not only discovered patterns within nature, but even recognized with another series of assumptions that, of course, they being made in the image of God meant that they could also comprehend nature themselves. They worked with that assumption, and quoting several of them, considered their fields of study as forms of worship, recognizing and celebrating the handiwork of their Creator. It didn't make them superstitious. It didn't isolate them or distance them from what's commonly accused of, and rightly so, some types of Christians today. If the individual is superstitious, paranoid, and delusional, they can be condemned based on a number of factors. But these scientists also were themselves Christians, and they used Christianity as motivation. Their belief in God was the reason why they believed that pursuing the sort of work that not only ended up saving lives like fields of medicine, one that I'm presently benefiting from, but also, and even more significantly, were the very reason why they believed these systems of study could even work. The founders of the concept of science, the founders of the concept of physics and microbiology, the fields of study which we take for granted today, are all being dominated by those who are at odds with the worldview that their very founders had. Now, once again, does that mean that atheism is at odds with science? Perhaps we'll get into that in a moment. But the emphasis is on the idea that to say and assume that belief in God means that you're automatically going to be anti-science, why can we give you historical citation of people who invented these fields of science, who founded these fields of study, were themselves Christians, and claimed in their own words to be motivated by their worldview, which is at odds with modern-day atheists that are, of course, enforcing their predominance over these topics. That is worth thinking about. Why is it that all, not most, all of the members of the scientific revolution, even Charles Darwin, were Christians to some degree? Darwin himself affirmed atheism later in life. It was before his journey to the Galapagos Islands because, interestingly enough, of an emotional issue regarding his inbred child dying from a disease that he refused to treat. But the point being made is this. When we ask the question, is there conflict philosophically between God and science? Properly defined, there's no grounds to say that. Is there grounds historically with the belief in God and science? And you can't, of course, make that case, especially in terms of the most relevant religion to this conversation, the one that I would hold. But let's ask the question then, where did this idea come from? Where did we historically discover who was the most prominent and naturally the earliest voice in pointing out that belief in God is in fundamental conflict with the concept of science? And the answer to that is a man by the name of John William Draper. In the 19th century, and upon the popularization of Darwinism, he used the spirit of trauma in the United States following the Civil War to popularize his book, History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. It was intended to challenge the Roman Catholic Church specifically and undermine their influence in the restoration of the Union. Fortunately, historians today have discovered that he was essentially the father of the modern Reddit forum, because the kind of personality that he demonstrates in his writing was not the kind of personality you could or would want to have any meaningful conversation with. And the reason for this wasn't because he disagrees with us on some philosophical issues. It's because facts and accuracy were secondary to owning the religious people he didn't like. And his work reflected that. He outright lied and fabricated information in order to make his case in his book, which is why the only people who do anything with his material are people who are like him. For example, the main popularizer of his philosophy and work was a man by the name of Andrew White, the founder of the first secular university, Cornell, who wrote an even more dramatic and verifiably false narrative that discussed the historical war, as opposed to conflict, with Christianity and science, but of course forgot that he had to be honest in his reports to be taken seriously. For example, and this is regarding William Draper's book, he claimed that St. Augustine wrote that the sky was scientifically a form of skin that God had stretched out above the earth. He left out, of course, that Augustine wasn't making a scientific claim. He was simply quoting Psalm 104 and verse 2, which is poetically saying that you stretch out the heavens. No description of the scientific term for dermis or epidermis in his studies. He didn't provide further commentary in saying that this was a form of skin, and of course, he just referenced it in terms of Hebrew poetry, then put words into his mouth saying that it was a scientific inaccuracy. He drew attention to the Inquisitions as a concerted effort to silence scientific discovery, as opposed to what it actually was in an attempt to put down religious dissension in the philosophy and theology department. They weren't targeting people on the basis of their scientific beliefs, and he provided no actual examples. And Andrew White, of course, himself popularized the concept that Galileo was persecuted because of his belief in heliocentrism, belief that the sun is the center of our orbit system, as opposed to geocentrism, that everything is orbiting around us. The actual facts were because Galileo, a man after my own heart, didn't suffer fools gladly and wouldn't stop making satirical mockery of the Pope when he asked him to stop being such a troll. And of course, not taking that lying down, they put him on house arrest. But then, of course, that didn't matter when it came to popularizing their hostility and bigotry. He accuses, again, the concept of the issues regarding science and religion as being fundamentally incompatible with the philosophies that we've discussed before. And of course, he was a fraud, just through and through. But the spirit of the book remains foundational for how the atheist community treats religion to this day. If you have to fudge history in order to make your case, then it's because truth isn't on your side. And if truth isn't on your side, then it doesn't reflect reality. And normally atheists are against things that wouldn't reflect reality. Yet there is no scientific law or principle that a scientist, or in this case, an activist, has to be honest in their findings. So, as you see in many atheist forums, that, of course, goes out the window. And this is where we really get into the heart of the conversation, because while there will be people that you run into, like John William Draper and Andrew White, there are also going to be people who, following the same script, are going to still argue that the concept of God only serves as an argument of a lack of information, as opposed to science, which is an argument from the presence of information or attainable information. And this is where it ultimately comes down to it. If you've ever heard the term God of the gaps fallacy, that's mainly what we're centering our conversation on dealing with here today. You hear this used, but oftentimes when you get into fallacy, then you're like, I didn't take philosophy in college. What's being talked about here? I think it's above my pay grade, and thus put the atheist in another position where they can hand you a definition, as we see from their community, that may or may not be honest. The reality of the God of the gaps fallacy is, again, to actually get to the heart of the issue. If the science has been dealt with, this is the actual problem. The rejection of the concept of God is because they have committed what is called the straw man fallacy, that they have created a false version of what we mean by God, dismantled and debunked it, and then claimed victory over the concept when they've only debunked their fake version rather than your actual claim. It would be just as insincere and disrespectful if we were to summarize atheism as just a rabble of irrational disciples of Draper and others, but of course their actions can reflect or reject that. We don't want to make the claim preemptively or without reason. And this is where we ultimately get into the math of the matter. The argument of the God of the gaps fallacy can be essentially summarized as this. If we're going to, make sure that the pluses and minuses are all together, it's arguing that God caused nature. G produces N. N, nature, causes nature. Therefore, G is N, that God will eventually be revealed to be natural phenomenon. For example, the ancient world didn't understand how precipitation worked in the water cycle, so they just said the gods made it rain. When knowledge, through scientific analysis, filled that gap, the curtain was pulled on the all-powerful Oz, which was then revealed to be a natural phenomenon rather than a supernatural one, and setting a trend by faith that all knowledge of the universe was formally attributed to the gods. They then believe, again, by faith, not based off of what they presently have, but a conclusion they're hoping for based on the reasons they have to trust scientists who have revealed all of this natural phenomena, will eventually be discovered as natural phenomenon too. So let me just summarize this again. G caused N caused N, therefore G is N. God is claimed to be the cause of nature. Scientists discover that nature is actually the concept of cause of nature. Therefore, God is just another natural process. It's just a way of explaining something that you don't yet have broken down into a formula. Well, there's a few problems with this, and we really need you all to pay attention to this because this is where ultimately this conversation can either break down or become very productive. First, there are things that are not natural phenomenon by definition. For example, we mentioned that before, scientific laws are not natural by definition. Human consciousness, not the chemical processes that can be, of course, artificially produced and experienced within the bag of lipids we call our brain, but consciousness itself, what separates the human body from a essentially bag of pork. Truth as a concept is not a scientific process. It is discovered, not created. It is an authority in what reflects reality, not reality itself. Ethics, morality, these are not concepts that you could chemically, physically, and of course, repeatably examine within nature. Yet they would hold authority over nature beyond those things themselves. There is no possible way for natural phenomenon to eventually be discovered in things that are by definition, even according to secular models, as not natural. And even within secular scientific models, you know what the majority of the universe they say is composed of? Dark matter, which if you ask them, how do you measure it? How do you determine it? What does it look like? What does it smell like? What's its weight? What's its mass? They don't know. They acknowledge its existence by faith because they need their models, which are, of course, changing all the time, to stick up in their simulations. But when it ultimately comes down to it, there are things that aren't natural by definition. So to argue that God will eventually be replaced by natural phenomena and that God only exists to replace that knowledge of what natural phenomena really is a faulty assumption, that these things aren't actually possible to bring to their logical end, that there are things in this universe that at the present we know we will never be able to find a natural explanation for because they are supernatural by definition, beyond or other than nature. The second problem is that there's more to the study and field of theology than explanations for nature. For example, as I mentioned before with truth and ethics, God's concept is explaining where our laws, ethics, and who gave these laws, these scientific laws, their weight over nature came from. The source and purpose of our consciousness, which again is not something that can be scientifically examined either. The standard by which we determine truth, the basis for morality, and more. If we say and grant the position that the only thing that God as a concept is trying to explain is what causes nature, that's a pagan argument, and we'd be just as much in line with using Isaiah 40 through 48 42 through 48 specifically, to debunk the concept when he gave his humorous parable of the man who cut a log in half, used part of it to warm his dinner, and the other half bowed down to it and thanked him for the meal. You just cooked dinner with half your God. What ultimately have you accomplished in this? Nature is not divine. And at the same time, the divine isn't nature. The second half of that clarification is where the God of the gaps fallacy makes its second mistake. The third, as I mentioned, is that the pagan arguments for nature and the Judeo-Christian arguments for the existence of Yahweh aren't the same thing. We know in the modern day, pagans personify concepts of nature and argue a concept called pantheism, that God is creation itself, as far as what they would consider or regard as divine. Christians and Hebrews believe in a conscious being outside of nature that introduced the laws of nature. And if he was competent and intelligent enough to not only do those things, but in a way that we all benefit from to this day, then that sort of sounds like God to me, an entity beyond time, space, and matter who has authority over all these things, consciousness to choose to introduce all these things, intelligence to make them in a way where we are still admiring the handiwork and even forming fields of study and engineering off of, known as biomimetics, on even the most microscopic of things in perfecting more efficient motors in regards to how their little tails are able to swim effectively in maintaining our bodies. But all of that is moot because it also is in conflict with another issue. The fourth issue with the God of the Gaps accusation is that scientists that discovered and founded the schools that analyzed those laws, as we mentioned before, were universally Christian and believed that God's design in nature, God's design of mankind in his image that could understand nature, and therefore their study of creation was an opportunity to worship God, to recognize what he was by knowing him through his handiwork, all shows that there's very little in the nature of science or philosophy that is actually incompatible with belief in God. Otherwise, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment would not have happened. So where does the actual conflict come in? Well, first and foremost, when it comes to the accusations that are made on both sides, you don't understand fields of science, atheists have a monopoly on this issue, you don't understand the history of science, nothing about it is incompatible. The real issue is that just like when Christians who try to make scientific arguments in favor of God, but clearly haven't done enough homework in order to understand that atheists have already kind of barricaded themselves within these arguments, and that the Christian, having not done his homework, ends up granting too many things that the atheist can then use against them. The other issue is also just as true, that there is ignorance on the part of the atheist in their objections to the concept of God. Atheists don't know what they're talking about when they conflate science and theology, the study of God, as two entirely different things. And note, they can be brilliant in their fields of study, but to then think that they understand the how would suddenly remove the need to understand where it came from is like saying that me studying anatomy in college was done in order to verify the fact I don't have biological parents. You're not explaining everything regarding the where when you understand the how. The concept of the why has no influence over the concept of where. We need to recognize that these are entirely different fields of study, and if the atheist that you're talking to, and hopefully you are regularly, is willing to grant that it's an entirely different topic of conversation to say, well, God is at odds with science. No, God is a different concept in science, while he may be rightly understood as the introducer of it. This and this are not going to ultimately be in conflict with each other because it's an entirely different field. And misrepresenting one or both in order to make your case puts you in very poor company, like the individuals who first tried to argue this by lying through their teeth. A good example of this was given by Dr. John Lennox As a mathematician and a very polite gentleman. He asked the individuals that he was speaking to, why is the kettle boiling? The law of thermodynamics, or because I want to make a cup of tea? Two entirely different fields where one doesn't eliminate the truth or validity of the other. So when we're talking about the actual issue at hand, they say there's no way to reconcile God and science. Well, there may be some conflict between God and scientists, but their opinions no more determine what science is than me lying about your past, present, and future suddenly alters your lived experience. So let's get down to the actual heart of the issue, the actual conflict between individuals and God. Not science and God, but the atheists and God are largely on the basis of three simple issues. The first is that of emotions. The second is regarding their social structure, and the third is on the basis of their ethics. The majority of atheist activists aren't passionate about atheism because of the truth it revealed, but because it is the equal and opposite reaction to a concept that they hate. They have social obligations to their family that make them want to disbelieve in God because those relationships are more important. Perfect example is my biological father, Ralph Scott Richards, who wanted the approval of my grandfather, who was at the time an atheist. His passion against Christianity wasn't because he was enlightened into atheism, but because he valued the love and approval of my grandfather and trusted his view of the world more than anyone who spoke contrary to him. But notice the assumption that my grandpa can't be wrong about anything wouldn't be any more influential or meaningful than for a Christian to say, well, my pastor is more reliable in studies of theology than I'll ever believe of you, so I'm going to believe him no matter how much evidence you show me. That'd be ridiculous. But in the same way, why is it that the atheist gets off the hook when they put themselves in the position of, I believe more of what Neil deGrasse Tyson has to say when he constantly spouts out about things he doesn't actually know anything about, and believes that his experience in studying the stars suddenly makes him an expert on something totally unrelated to the function, position, and activities of the stars. We also need to note as well that they can have moral desires for their lives, that they see God as an obstacle to enjoying, and thus they will make the exchange. Perfect example of this was the historical atheist activist Thomas Huxley, also nicknamed Darwin's Bulldog, because, and this is quoting him, he said that he believed atheism because it allowed him to sleep with whoever he wanted. In his words, it justified his sexual mores. But this is ultimately bubkiss, because when it comes down to it, you having a greater desire for carnal physical pleasure and taking advantage of women and wanting to snuff out your conscience in allowing for the concept of God and being accountable for how you are treating women and your own body by extension, don't suddenly alter the concept of reality. Me wanting something more than what is there to suddenly not make it there. And lastly, they can have traumatic experiences that were associated with Christianity that make them want to avoid the concept altogether. Best example of this in the modern day is the illustrious Richard Dawkins, who was molested by a British school teacher who claimed to be Roman Catholic. Thus, again, it shows why his passion against the Christian worldview is abhorrent to him, not because of the data, but because of his trauma, which is, again, worth empathizing towards, but certainly does not make him an objective analyzer of data beyond his field. He's a brilliant biologist, but we know where his actual beliefs stem from, and we also recognize that it's not a rational position, because he's been asked on numerous occasions, if evidence were shown to you, if the stars realigned to spell out I am God, if you appeared before, this is in the case of Peter Adkins, the pearly gates with St. Peter. I don't know why they still continue to argue that Jesus giving Peter the keys to the kingdom wasn't because he was the gatekeeper. There was, of course, that being given to all the apostles, but I digress. Feel free to ask about that later this week. It's because he said nothing would ever convince me, because I would just assume that the concept of powerful aliens, a la Shermer's Last Law, skirt chaser Shermer. Let you guess who, again, what kind of category he fits into regarding his atheism. But nonetheless, supernatural, extraterrestrial, and technologically advanced civilizations are indistinguishable from God. That's his claim. And he would say that I'd be more willing to believe that I had gone insane or was hallucinating, or that powerful aliens were just trolling him. And that, of course, stems from his worldview and default position. But it's all centered around that problem. It's not about the intellect or the data. It's, frankly, a childish attempt to dismiss what they don't want to be true, for whatever reason. And it's not very scientific of them to hide from the data. So before we spend the rest of our time going into your follow-up questions, let's just recap what we've discussed. The argument is that science is fundamentally incompatible with the concept of God, that you either believe in God or you believe in science. You can't, because they cancel each other out. The definition of science, which we talked about, is on the basis of knowledge, that's what the word means, is not in of itself in conflict with the concept of God. You can know about the things of God when he reveals them to you, or when you recognize his handiwork in creation. Christians can argue that, a la Romans chapter 1 and Deuteronomy 32. We could note the field of science, the study of cause and effect, was not only invented by a Christian, Sir Francis Bacon, but also noting that the examination of creation, or just what happens to be there, is something that could be done from a Christian worldview and a secular point of view, a worldview. So it's not incompatible in the exercise or the definition. The focus of science, what is tangible and observable, does not exclude God either, because there are assumptions made within science that scientific laws, that these universal, not invented but discovered realities, have authority over all of nature, impact nature directly, and yet aren't of nature themselves. They are other than natural. We noted other examples like consciousness, morality, ethics, and even dark matter. We could note that the assumption of empiricism, and that the idea of a worldview like Christianity couldn't produce any sort of meaningful scientific contributions to the world, is false. And we mentioned over 15 individuals who were the pioneers and founders of the scientific revolution, who themselves were all Christians. We could note then the source and first voice to say that there was a conflict between science and religion, John William Draper, who was then later popularized by Cornell founder Andrew White, were both frauds in the information that they reported, and had no problem misrepresenting the data in order to sensationalize hostility, specifically towards Roman Catholics in the beginning because of political reasons, as opposed to intellectual or scientific. The God of the gaps fallacy, G caused N caused N, therefore G is N, is based on a faulty assumption of what G, God, is. The idea that God is only there to explain natural phenomenon is a pagan argument, not a Judeo-Christian argument. And for atheists to assume that every concept of God is taught, believed in, and evidenced by the exact same things is ignorant, which ultimately brings us to the actual issue. When an atheist argues that the only reason that Christians believe in God is because they want to get away from science, well, in our experience, they definitely mask and showboat themselves a lot. But the only reasons that people have to believe atheism, speaking to the individual who normally occupied the position of the burrito there, actually that's my seat, anyway, is on the basis of what? It's based off of social climate, based off of moral preferences, based on trauma, but not on the basis of intellect or data. There's nothing in conflict with God and science. There's simply a conflict between atheists and God. And if it's an emotional issue, they need to have those things worked through. If it's a trauma-based issue, they need the kind of gentleness and time that, of course, will heal if they allow it to. If it is on the basis of social issues, then they need to ultimately make a choice as far as who is more important to them, because Jesus himself said, "He who loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me." If you're put in a position where you have to choose over God or the approval of your parents, Jesus recommends God because your parents aren't always going to be here, but you will answer to him for how you lived your life. This is neither here nor there, though, because it ultimately comes from a community that is either fostering misrepresentations of our positions or is dependent on us not knowing the data. We've taken the time to make sure that you are aware of the data and that you can properly handle yourselves in those kinds of situations, and I hope that this has been edifying to all of you. We got about 2 minutes left before the music will cut us off, so let's go out to your questions here. Got a long email from Shari. I think the time will go out before I have the chance to read all of it. It's regarding dying to self. We'll be happy to address this tomorrow, Shari. We got a question here regarding the end times. In my opinion, what future leaders do you think make up the 10 kings that will rule with the Antichrist during the tribulation? If you ask for my opinion, I could pretty much present you any other piece of worthless information. I don't know. But when it comes down to it, if we had asked this question at any other time in history, we would probably say, for example, in the 1800s, argue that Prussia would definitely be one of them. It's not a nation anymore. If you'd asked in the mid-1900s, you'd probably say, oh, Soviet Russia is definitely going to be something the Antichrist uses. It's not a country anymore. We could note other influences that can rise and fall and that have risen and fallen as quote-unquote superpowers that aren't the case. When it comes down to it, speculating would be a waste of time because we'll only know who's in positions of prominence, not just leading up to that time, but especially during that time. If you want to know where the whole concept, for those listening, of those 10 kings ruling with the beast for 1 hour when their authority is ultimately taken away, that's from Revelation chapters 17 through 18, which are both in reference to Daniel chapters 7, 9, and all the way through the end to 12, where the kingdom of the 10-horned beast is detailed. One more here. God said David shed too much blood. Is that because of his wars with the Philistines or the murder of Uriah? Neither. The reason why it wasn't because he had shed too much blood. It just says that you're a man of blood. This is in the book of Chronicles. The reason why Solomon was picked was because he hadn't fought any wars at all. There was no limit or cap to how you could be used by God. David undoubtedly was used by God very powerfully and was a man after God's own heart. He desired a relationship with him, but his calling would be different than that of his son, and it would be a house of peace. Thus the name Shlomo, peaceful. God bless you.
You've been listening to A Reason for Hope. Thank you again for joining us as we continue our journey through God's Word, one question of the heart at a time. Until we meet again, we would love to connect with you. You can text or email your questions to questionsforhope@gmail.com. You can also find out more about our ministry at calvarychristianfellowship.com. And be sure to join us next time on A Reason for Hope. A Reason for Hope is an outreach ministry of Calvary Christian Fellowship in Tucson, Arizona.